Our speaker was born and went to school in Doylestown. I verified that just today speaking to his mother. And fittingly, his subject tonight is growing up in Doylestown, which he agreed to speak about last April when he received the Bucks County Ambassador Award at the Chamber of Commerce Lifetime Achievement Awards program. I'll wait for these two somewhat latecomers. I didn't want him to miss what's probably my best line. He later told me he accepted the invitation because if he didn't, his mother would kill him. And mothers, we know, can be very powerful. He said because of his back-breaking schedule, he has to turn down several requests a day for speaking engagements, and he wanted this to be informal, casual, no advanced publicity. And so, as you know, many of you know, we restricted the attendance to our officers and directors and some special guests. We count ourselves very fortunate, his mother aside, to have him talk to us. And again, my apologies about the Phillies. The game was not over. Growing up in Doylestown, yes, but he really outgrew Doylestown and Bucks County and became a regional star and now a national media celebrity. If you Google him, you can watch his interview with the president on August 20th, which was the first media interview the president granted. He has authored 5 best-selling books, the latest just off the press called Instinct, the story of the interception of the 20th hijacker, would-be hijacker, by a Puerto Rican immigration inspector, and that no doubt prevented even more major destruction than occurred on 9/11. The manager of the Doylestown bookshop, at my request, has ordered in a large supply of the book. It was just published on September 15th, I believe. And he told me the author holds the record of signing some 300 books there in about 2 hours. We won't ask him to explain that because that's not what this program is about. He does a daily radio show from 5 to 9 a.m. and he has often hosted and been on national TV shows. He still keeps his hand in as a lawyer and has a relatively large family. But this evening, much as in our video interviews, our speaker has been asked to talk about his recollections of Doylestown and what it was like to grow up here. He'll speak for 20 to 30 minutes, take a handful of questions, and I'll then recognize a few of our guests. I'm delighted to present Michael Smerconish on growing up in Doylestown.
Thank you very much, Judge. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. Truth be told, he left me no choice as to whether I would be here. He told me when I would be here, for how long I would speak, and who I would meet afterwards. Last night, I was on Hardball. This morning from 6 until 9, I hosted the first of 2 daily radio programs that I do every day. And as had been my goal for the last 10, if not 15 years, I wanted a program in national syndication. I got 2. So this morning's program was heard in 15 markets, including Philadelphia, including Savannah, including Atlanta, Monroe, Louisiana. Why all the southern towns, I have no idea. St. Louis, and a variety of others. The midday program reaches 40 markets. And the midday program is from noon until 3, so I spoke for 6 hours today before coming here. The midday program is heard in Philadelphia, it's heard in New York City, it's heard in Los Angeles, Indianapolis, Austin, Dallas, etc. I tell you this with only a small degree of braggadocio, some, but a small degree. Neither of those programs, nor last night on Hardball, is intimidating for me. This is a bit intimidating. To come here and to walk in and to have my father here, because whatever stories I may tell, he knows the real version. And you know him, he may choose to tell you otherwise. But to walk in and to see so many friends is a wonderful thing. Karen McElhenney was the first person, Karen Putnam, as I walked in the door, which immediately brings flashbacks, and then to see Tom Scarborough. Back in 1986, the 2 of us and a field of others ran for the state legislature. I think we still disagree as to which of us Karen favored, but we both lost the race. My margin was 419 votes. I'm not sure about Tom's. I've since located 236 of those people. This is my good material, Chuck. To prepare to speak, because I've spoken often, I speak every day, I speak for a living, and I've addressed many subjects in the past, but never this subject. How do you prepare at Judge Ludwig's invitation to talk about growing up in Doylestown? I talked to both of my parents, we reminisced about stories, that was a lot of fun, but in my case, I reached for a photo album. I have always been the family archivist, and it was a great pleasure for me to look at all the old pictures and think about some of the stories of growing up in Doylestown, because I have always loved this community and have mostly favorable recollections of growing up. You know, there weren't too many downtimes growing up here. In my case, I was born March 15, the Ides of March of 1962, and I was born at the old Doylestown Hospital. Not the old Doylestown Hospital, for those who know, but the old Doylestown Hospital. And I came into this world and was taken home to North Garden Apartments on North Street. As a matter of fact, I think the Gardys were if not, where are the Gardys? If we're not, we're at there. Not that I remember then, I remember the Gardys from later. But that was my first address, North Garden Apartments. When my parents moved to Doylestown, cold crackers from the northeastern part of the state, their first home in Doylestown, and this is the subject of some family dispute, was either on top of Barger's or right next door to Barger's. Me, all I remember is that if I were homesick from school, it meant chicken salad from Barger's, which, if you recall, was a wonderful, wonderful treat. We lived at 24 Mercer Avenue after North Garden Apartments. That was really my home growing up. It's a rare day that I will come to Doylestown without driving down that street and thinking out loud about everyone who lived on Mercer Avenue. And it's kind of funny because the Wrigleys were on one side of us, and the Schutts were on the other, and the McFarlands were across the street, and the Haggertys were on the corner, and the Stockles, who had the only in-ground swimming pool on Mercer Avenue, hence the name Stockel Valley Country Club, went down the block. They were at 42 Mercer Avenue. And as I was thinking about how I still can picture, I can still remember who lived in every one of those homes, I had a frightening thought, and that is, that today on the main line, and now I understand why David Brenner once said, oh, out on the main line where every other house is missing. I don't know who lives in the house that is too removed from me. I'm not proud of that, but it's such a dichotomy as to what life was like in Doylestown and what life has become for me today, both the good and the bad. The Schutts were right next door, and Leroy and Vera Schutt, very formal people. A man who through the 1970s was always wearing a bow tie, as my dad will recall. He was also my science teacher, which became uncomfortable because it was in that 8th grade year at Hollycombe that his responsibility was to teach sex education. So here was formal Mr. Schutt next door teaching me sex education. I won't look at any of you when I tell you that I thank God that it was Jim Battelle who was called on to read aloud that day and not me, and he informed the class about the penis and Virginia. One end of the street, and I like to say that we lived in the shadow of Fawn Hill. Fawn Hill was at one end of the street on Mercer Avenue, and Conti's was at the other end and around the corner. And Fawn Hill and the Mercer Woods, which today I know like the back of my hand because we used to build underground forts throughout the Mercer Woods. But that became a playground of sorts. And Fawn Hill at that time was still inhabited by Mrs. Swain. Remember Mrs. Swain?
Yeah.
Mrs. Swain had been granted a life estate by Henry Chapman Mercer, and she was older when we would play there. But if you knocked on the door of the castle and had the right disposition and offered her 50 cents and said that's all you had to your name, she would take you on a tour. And it's funny because I've since been back with our children to take the formal tour, and I never, of course, tell the folks at the who run it today, but it's nothing like Mrs. Swain's tour. Mrs. Swain, and she was famous always for saying, come along, come along, come along. Those were her words. I'll never forget her ushering you along by telling you that. And the highlight of the tour at Fawn Hill was a chest which she told you contained the remains of a pirate, and by God, don't open the chest, or the pirate may come to life. At the other end of the street, Connie's Cross Keys Inn, where my brother worked as a busboy, and it's kind of funny to think about this now because the first lobster I ever tasted was from someone else's plate at Conti's. Someone should order a lobster at Conti's and not touch the tail. He'd bring it home as a busboy, and that became a late night snack. There was also the Arctic Market. I don't know if anybody remembers the Arctic Market. I think Dunkin' Donuts is there. It's funny the way for me to say to my parents, where am I going? The Doylestown Historical Society, and Mom said, well, it's on South Main, and I said, well, is it near Nick Malloy, or is it across from Woolworths, or is it on a different place? She said, Woolworths? What are you talking about? So when I think of the locations, I think of the Arctic Market instead of Dunkin' Donuts. I'll never forget when the Philadelphia Eagles drafted a 6'8" new wide receiver named Harold Carmichael. And Harold Carmichael made a personal appearance at the Arctic Market. And he was there for a raffle. And the raffle that day was won by me. I won't tell you how many I had in the ballot box, but the prize was preseason tickets to an Eagles-Bengals game. And I'll never forget this giant of a man reaching in his pocket and handing me a dime, because that's what phone calls cost, and we hadn't seen cell phones, so that I could call home and explain to my parents that we were going to see the Eagles because Harold Carmichael had pulled my name out in a raffle. When I was 12, in those same Mercer Woods, I was stung by a bee right here. It was a wasp, actually. And my parents were out, and my neck started to swell. And the Steelman family recognized that this was a real problem and got me to the Doylestown Hospital. They say just in the nick of time. I had an allergy. I was allergic to bee stings. And for the duration of that year of my life, I think it was the 3rd grade, for a solid year, every Wednesday, I'd be dismissed at Doyle early so that I could go see Clifford Laudenslager. Dr. Laudenslager was the family doctor, and every week he would give me an injection. I also recall getting stung before that desensitization had taken place a second time, had the same reaction. This time it was my mother who took me to the ER at the Doylestown Hospital, still the old one. And I remember them telling her that if it should happen again and we were away from medical treatment, that she should is it my clavicle? Reach here at my clavicle with a steak knife and cut a hole in my throat. I knew I could not get stung for a third time. Our house on Mercer Avenue, it's funny, I've been back since, just knocking on the door and asking if I can walk inside. It was 3 bedrooms and 1 bath. We didn't have a shower in that house until the 8th grade. We had a tub, which seems kind of fun. I tell that to our kids now, and they find it hard to believe that there wasn't a shower in our bath till the 8th grade. There weren't too many renovation projects that took place at the house, but when they took place, we had an interesting workforce. At the time, my dad was not only teaching school and then a guidance counselor, but he was running the adult education program at the rehab center of the Bucks County Prison. And when inmates were eligible for work release, they would often come and work at our house. So I can tell you, and this was a mystery to me, I didn't know who these people were, but I can tell you that a man named Coleman Foley built our kitchen, and that Mr. Clymer built our basement rec room. And my parents have each often told me about the night, they of course had to drive these men back to their homes at the end of the evening. They've each told me about the night that we drove home Mr. Clymer, and I remarked on the size of his house as well as his family. Which also reminds me that on a different day and in a different era, my mother came home from work midday and walked up a staircase at our home, and we had a small landing area, and then you make a turn and you go up the rest of the way to the bathroom that didn't have the shower. And she looked out the window on our back patio, and there was a man seated there, and he looked like he was wearing a uniform of sorts. She opened the window and she said, "Can I help you?" And he darted off through the backyard. She called the police. The first question the Doylestown Borough Police wanted to know was, "Well, how many of them did you see?" To which she responded, "How many of them are there?" And they said, "Well, there are 2 inmates who've escaped from the Bucks County Prison." She ran out of the house and the police had to come and search 24 Mercer Avenue. My father was the disciplinarian between the 2. Dad had a distinctive whistle. I don't know if he can do it today. I don't know when the last time that he did it was, but at the end of a play day, his piercing whistle from 2 blocks away, because we were often playing sports 1 street over, that would let you know that it was time to shut down the day and come home for dinner. But don't be fooled. Those who know my mother, and I assume that's all of you, Mom wielded the yardstick. Her weapon of choice was the yardstick, and we knew where she hid it. And we would often hide it from her if we knew we were in hot water. Let me give you an example. In the late 1960s, there was a fella in town. I'm not sure if memory is correct about this. I think it was the Pebble Hill Church with which he was associated. His name was Gordon Drop.
Yeah.
And he was a free spirit of sorts and became somewhat of a mentor to younger people. And Gordon Drop would take control a coffee house. Well, what I remember is he would take control of the old borough school before it burnt. It was a YMCA on the ground floor, and he would have dances on Friday nights. And we had a '66 Chevy Impala in those years. It was a green Chevy Impala that I can picture now. And I recall that my father was refereeing a football game on a Friday night, and my brother wanted desperately to go to a dance that Gordon Drock was the chaperone for at the YMCA. And here was Mom, literally in her bathrobe, with me in the back seat, dropping off my brother, who was probably 14, 15 at the time, going to the big dance. And to use her descriptor, when she dropped him off and took a look out the car window, she sized up the crowd and decided they were hoodlums. So she circled the block in the '66 Chevy, pulled back up on the curb, put it in park, left the motor running, grabbed me by the hand, went inside the YMCA in the bathrobe, and dragged him out of the dance. Mom was the disciplinarian. My recollection of the center of Doylestown is a Rockwellian image of Doylestown. And I think about how so many towns across the country today, you'd be blindfolded and go onto a main street and they all look the same. That's not the way that it was in the era in which I grew up in Doylestown. For example, I remember that if you were talking real estate, it was J. Carroll Malloy. I had the privilege of knowing J. Carroll Malloy, and of course Nick Malloy I'm seeing here now. Real estate, you would think Malloy. You would also, by the way, think a guy who used to wear a scarf in the middle of July. You never quite figured out Win James. There was no Starbucks. You know, if you wanted a cup of coffee, you went to Ed's Diner. If you needed printing, you went to Carter Gardy. If it was a pharmacy that you needed, Weiss bars for drugs. Joe Kenny was the guy who would sell you your book long before there were Barnes and Noble and all the big book chain stores, or your concert tickets. Wilson Varco for funeral, Al Buck for hardware, and Meininger's Sports Haven for your athletic gear. Which brings me to a second raffle story. Meininger's was at the end of our street, and once they too had a raffle, it was for a sailboat. And as luck would have it, I won that one as well. This time, having reflected on winning the Eagles tickets with Harold Carmichael, I was too embarrassed to collect my prize. I called my parents and I asked them if they would please go up to Meininger's and claim it. I have watched this town change. I remember when Burger King replaced a miniature golf. I remember when the Courthouse Motor Inn replaced a farmhouse where we used to play football outside. I remember when Hess's came to the Doylestown Shopping Center, and I believe that I am the only living person who remembers what is now Dairy Queen on North Main, what it was originally built as. Nope.
Burger Chef.
Burger Chef. That is correct. Just, you know, one of those funny locations that it never, I guess it works now, but it never seemed to work. You know, you've seen it flip so many different times. Doyle Elementary is where I went to elementary school. Mr. Larlick drove the bus. Don McClintock, Mr. McClintock was the principal. Mrs. McClintock was the librarian. I had spent my preschool years at the Atkinson VFW. And what I remember about preschool at the VFW is that every day there would be a nap time in the middle of the day. And if you dozed off to sleep or convinced your teacher that you dozed off to sleep, they place a star on the card that had your name, and at the end of the marking period, that became your report card. How many stars you have. I also remember that when my parents came to the school, I introduced Pop Hines, the janitor, as the principal. The preschool. I had Mrs. Shannon for both first and second grade at Doyle. She was extraordinary. I had Miss Yon for third. I had Mr. Reckner for fourth. I remember Mr. Reckner well. Mr. Reckner, his heritage was Salvadoran. And on the first day of school, we walked in Doyle in the North Wing, and he informed the class that he was a bit disappointed as he was beginning the year. I thought, why is our teacher disappointed in us already? Well, he wasn't disappointed in us. He was disappointed in the Central Bucks School Board. And that's because he told us that he had recently made an appeal to them that we should all get on his bus, which was a converted school bus for sleeping purposes, and drive to El Salvador and spend the entire school year on the road, but by golly, they told him we couldn't do it. So I went home that night and informed our family at the dinner table of this disappointment, and then my brother, who had Harry Reckner 4 years earlier, said he told us the same thing. I also remember that the fourth grade year was the worst haircut of my life. In Cross Keys near Bard Lynn, there were the 5 barbers. And the 5 barbers were our haircut place of choice. I can remember my father would always get the Princeton. So I went in there one day without any supervision, and there was a particular barber who didn't speak much English. His name was Henry, and Henry gave me the haircut. And when I got home, I looked in the mirror, and at least to my mind's eye, it was a 45-degree angle for my haircut. At which point, I dialed the 5 barbers. I asked for Henry, and I informed him that he had just butchered me. I'll never forget having to walk into Harry Reckner's 4th grade class with that god-awful haircut. One of my sons recently thought he had a bad haircut, and I quickly told him the story about the 4th grade at Doyle. I had Miss Better for 5th grade and Mr. Elwell for 6th. Mr. Elwell was a first-year teacher who had been a track star at Temple. He'd run in the Penn relays. He was a terrific guy. Oddly enough, when the recent book came out, he came to a book signing of mine. And it was just so overwhelming for me to see Mr. Elwell, who just retired. He had just retired, and here he was, that I was a student of his first class ever. I recall that that 6th grade year was a year when I guess the hormones were active, because at recess, Lisa Siliberto would regale us by reading aloud from Reader's Digest. Reader's Digest at the time, every month, would have a different part of the anatomy write a column. And I have a vivid recollection of her reading aloud, "I am Jane's womb," on the Doyle playground during the 6th grade. Is this what you had in mind? There was a magic craze in Doylestown in those years, and indeed across the country. I think Doug Henning had done a Broadway show called The Magic Show, and consequently, those of us growing up here, and I guess across, we wanted to be magicians. And I took it very seriously. I'll never forget that Mr. Garvey printed for me magician cards. And the magician cards said, had a picture of a magician, Mike Smerconish, amateur magician. And on the card it said, fee, donation. And the other kids all had an interest in magic, but in my case, I would actually go out and do shows, and I kept a diary. And the funniest thing in the world is to go back and to read my recollections of doing magic all over Doylestown, how much I got paid, what tricks functioned and didn't function, and how hostile the crowd was. Little League then was not the travel sport that it's become today. If you played Little League, and I did, your games were either in Maplewood or at Community Field. I have a recollection of Mom driving us to practice, or pardon me, a tryout one year, stepping up at the plate and hitting a home run over the left field fence. I'll never forget that. Movies were at the county. In one particular summer in the late 70s, I saw Slapshot 10 times because I knew the ticket taker from my class. It was also at the county theater that I became acquainted with streaking. You remember the streaking craze? One night after the Bad News Bears. I guess I can say this because the statute of limitations has indeed run. It was Kevin Benstead. And Kevin Benstead streaked from the back alley of the county to the old Leatherman and Godshaw across the street, and then on up to the Continental Bank. I remember the telephone number for Dominic's, 215-348-9656. A, because we ordered a lot of pizza. B, because it was a favorite for crank calls. We played a lot of street hockey. When the Flyers were hot in the early 70s, we played Nerf football at our bus stop. I had my first radio experience on South Main Street, about 2 blocks south. And it didn't occur to me until recently that the first radio experience that I had was right here in Doylestown. The police chief at the time was Chief Tutt. And Chief Tutt had a son named Scott Tutt. And Scott Tutt, he owned Key Records, 3 buildings up from where Malloy is right now. I think it's a Rice, as a matter of fact, location. And he also had a recording studio. And I don't know why, but one day we got the call and we rounded up kids in the neighborhood to go record a commercial for WBUX at Scott Tutt's recording studio on South Main Street. The commercial was for Sylvan Pools. I would legitimately have difficulty telling you what I had for lunch today and certainly dinner last night. But this I remember. Before you take the plunge, be sure you talk to Sylvan. Before you take the plunge, be sure you get the facts. Family engineered for fun and recreation, Sylvan has the pool to keep you all relaxed. So, before you take the plunge, be sure you talk to Sylvan. Before you get the picture. First radio experience, wasn't paid for that one. Speaking of Chief Tutt and his son, Scott Tutt, I have a recollection of my first political experience ever. That too was in Doylestown, and it was the night that our parents took us to a borough council meeting. I have since asked them, why did we go? Neither has a clear answer. On the agenda that night, this had to have been the reason, is that Scott Tutt wanted to stage a Woodstock-like festival in Doylestown. And he did. And he did. And I can remember that the night before we drove the same street, I guess it's West Street, the same street that Doyle is on, and there, the bypass has since taken the place of the field where it took place. But I remember A, watching the debate in Doylestown about whether to permit a rock concert, and B, going and seeing the net effect. We didn't go to summer camp. Our summers were spent at Fanny Chapman at the Borough Dam. We'd be dropped off and asked to spend the entire day in that location. At some point, our parents joined the Doylestown Country Club. And so in the summer, that became the spot of choice. And we, again, would be dropped off and expected to spend the entire day at the Doylestown Country Club. I remember one particular day, there was a homeowner in close proximity to the country club. There was a creek that separated the Doylestown Country Club from his home, and he had blueberry bushes. And we were forever playing tennis, baseball, and eating the blueberries. And he was livid about it, and he complained to the country club. Well, one thing led to another. Long story short, we were all removed because of the blueberry incidents from the country club for 3 days, as I recall. Nobody told their parents. So the following day, all the kids, and there were about a dozen of us, got dropped off, because that's what we would do every day. We all got dropped off. We all just sort of stood around until I think the Scalides figured out that there was a problem. And then all our parents came and picked us up and grounded us at home. There was a carnival every year behind the Doylestown Shopping Center, where Heritage Towers are now. That's where we go for fireworks. My brother was in the first class ever at Hollycomb. It was brand spanking new. As a matter of fact, I remember his first days of school were delayed when Hollycomb opened, and he was in that initial class. I remember that the principal was Mr. Hockman, and that jeans were a controversy. Seems funny in retrospect then, but you still couldn't wear jeans through that time period. My brother was 4 years ahead of me. He went to CB East after Hollycomb. He had a skill to throw the football, really had a gift at throwing the football, but nevertheless, in his sophomore year, was number 4 on the depth chart. So these were the days when CB West was dominant. This was the Frank Case era of high school football, and CB East was a perennial loser. And in the week preceding the East-West game, there was a keg party. And there were a lot of students there from CB East, and the police arrived. The following Monday, football practice, going into the Thanksgiving game, the coach of the football team was Bob Portnick, Coach Portnick. The time is now. They had a slogan, I remember, because we had buttons, and I wasn't on the team, of course, but I would wear my brother's button. He asked everybody to line up on the goal line, and then instructed everyone who'd been present at the keg party to take one step forward. And nobody moved. Well, he then pulled out the list of all the attendees, because he already knew, and they were all suspended from the team. That included the first, second, and third string quarterback. My brother in his sophomore year now became the starting quarterback for CB East against CB West with 10,000 people watching. My favorite part of the story is when I asked him why he hadn't been at the party, and his answer was, because I got bad directions. I was leaving Doyle at the time and headed to Hollycomb. We were still on Mercer Avenue. I was absolutely miserable, because the way they had drawn the lines meant that only 6 of those who were at Doyle would go together out to Hollycomb, traveling by bus 6.5 miles. This was the sort of the Doylestown equivalent of busing. Someone had the good thought to plan that sooner or later development would come and they would need to build those schools out in Buckingham. But back then, you know, the farms still existed, and consequently they needed to bus kids from Doylestown to go out and fill Hollycomb. I remember well so many different things that happened in that era, that Hollycomb era. First of all, at home, my mother, who had been a secretary at the Bucks County Free Library at Monument Square, Harry Weeks was the fellow who was then running the library, and Dad was a guidance counselor, and Mom decided that when the state of Pennsylvania was going to increase the requirement for real estate credits, that it was time for her to take her test. She'd completed high school but hadn't gone further, and she'd always had it in the back of her mind that she would get her real estate license. I remember that she was late in turning in the paper, I think because she had butterflies, and that Ed Howard had to intercede. State Senator Ed Howard had to intercede to make sure that she could sit for the test. I also recall that she enrolled in the Schlichter-Kratz Real Estate Institute in Lansdale. I don't know if they still exist. And my role, and I performed it well, was to follow her around the house with this blue, thick book with all sample questions and ask them out loud. And she went, she passed the test. She initially was working with Ed Crawford, best known, I think, for his time and temperature sign, where the borough offices are now, and then joined Nick Malloy. I recall as well having my first television experience while at Hollycomb. I told you that I had my first radio experience on South Main Street. My first television experience was a little bit different. My father got a telephone call one day. He was at UNAMI as a guidance counselor, and at the other end of the phone was Tom Roberts. Mr. Roberts was the vice principal of Hollycomb, and he was calling to inform my father that I had exposed myself and that I had been suspended from school. And that's the way he expressed it, by the way, that I had, my poor father thought that I dropped trowel coming out of the men's room, and that he had a real problem on his hand. What Dad didn't know initially was that I flicked a moon in gym class in front of the camera for morning announcements. Hollycomb was so sophisticated that morning announcements were on a closed circuit television system. So that every morning you would have the, it may have even been a prayer then, I'm not sure, a flag salute. And one day I was in gym class and they were filming a commercial for the upcoming gym show, and I thought it would be funny, a little class clownish, if I flicked a moon. And I did, and we watched it, but like Nixon, I let the tape stay. It was my undoing. My best sports days were while I was at Hollycomb. In my ninth grade year at Hollycomb, I remember well that our football team was undefeated. We were 5-0 playing Lenape. And Lenape then, Carter Gardy was a standout in playing sports at Lenape at the time, both pitching, we pitched against each other, Hollycomb and Lenape, and played football against each other. Lenape was 0-5. We were 5-0, they were 0-5. And it was the last game of the season, and we tied 6-6. We were cocky, and they were just cruising to give us a bruising. And it's kind of funny because that team at Hollycomb then matured and became, without my presence, the first CB East team to ever beat a CB West team in football. That was my senior year. When I think about my youth in Doylestown, I apologize for getting long-winded, I'm just going to speak for a couple more minutes. When I think about my youth in Doylestown, it's often summarized or characterized by work experiences. Because I always worked, I always had jobs. Where Maine meets Union, remember? Where Maine meets, which was, I think, his stands? Was it his stands?
Yes, it was.
Okay, and there was something that as a kid I was terrified of, to go into his stands, and they had a well inside. I know they had a huge hole that you'd look down once you got in that place. It always gave me the creeps. Well, in a later incarnation, it became Where Maine Meets Union, and Jack McGregor sold women's clothing there, and my first job was literally sweeping the sidewalk for $3 an hour at Where Maine Meets Union, and he had a small strip of grass out back, and I would mow the lawn. I was proud to work at McDonald's when they first opened up in Doylestown, and it's funny how things have changed, because then we competed to work at McDonald's. Today, there's like a permanent help wanted sign that you have at a McDonald's, and I was thrilled to work there. I was the maintenance man. I didn't have to wear the uniform if I were the maintenance man, and then when they finally changed the rule, they said, you have to wear the uniform, that was the end of me at McDonald's. I remember the day that the Mac bus pulled up at McDonald's. We got a call from the Lansdale McDonald's, and they wanted us to know that the Mac bus was in the vicinity. The Mac bus was a nationwide roving bus of supervisors with stopwatches. And they would show up unannounced, and they'd stand in line, and they'd see how clean is the place and how long does it take to get your food. I was there when the Mac bus came to Doylestown. I delivered flowers for Grouse. I washed dishes at Philip Arthur's. One summer I painted street address numbers with Dave McFarland on 5,000 curbs throughout the entire Central Bucks area. But for the most part, I worked for the Stockles at Mountain Lake Pool and Patio. They really were my employer of choice, and Mike and Arlene remain close friends to this day, and were terrific with me then. Went to CB West, no longer really had the athletic talent. I was sort of what do they say, small fish in a big pond. Had a good experience, and then went on to Lehigh, and eventually, I guess when I think about when did I leave Doylestown, it was probably after running for office in 1986, and not with any ill will or bad feeling, but just because I was then in law school, and when law school ended, I went in a different direction. I've never left the area. I've spent my whole life within a 50-mile radius. College at Lehigh, law school downtown at Penn. And now, the funny thing is that we've come back to the area of sorts, because my wife and I bought a home in Solebury, and we both lead pretty chaotic existences, and this is where we spend our time on weekends. And a large part of the motivation in doing so, at least for me, was to at least in some way recreate for our 4 children, 3 relatively young sons, 9, 11, and 13, some of those memories that we have, that I have of Doylestown. I could still take them to the county for a movie. We can still go out and tube on the Delaware, and we can still go to the Mercer Museum and do the sort of things that I look back fondly and think of. One thing that you probably don't need to be told because of your involvement in the Historical Society, but to leave and to come back is to have a renewed sense of appreciation. To grow up as a young person in Doylestown, I knew it was a wonderful place. I knew that I was fortunate to be here, but to leave and then to come back is really to say, this is a special place. So whenever asked, it's always Doylestown that I'll say that I'm from for all the reasons that I tried to give you the snapshot of. Thank you so much for allowing me to do this. I know I give you a workout when you come and speak, and I said, geez, please, it's so darn busy these days, but to me, to think through some of what went on, a real pleasure. Really, really a pleasure.
You want to handle the questions?
Sure, if there are questions, I'd love to handle it.
A few questions.
Who will break the ice? You don't have to say limited to Doylestown.
One addendum is the quarter midget racing that went on down at the Heritage
God.
Town.
Yeah.
So I
And you know what, Friday night, the quarter midget racing, we would hear that thunder right out my back window, as a matter of fact. I absolutely remember that track. We'd go over and ride our bikes. They never liked it, but we would ride our bikes around that track as well. And then go to Cartex and get foam rubber that we would use as golden pads. But the quarter midget track is worthy of a shout out. Yeah. Anybody else?
Michael, you're being very modest about your sports and about your ability. You did some good things.
Had a lot of fun here. Really had a lot of fun.
Very much.
Thank you. Be nice to say that.
Thank you.
Entertaining and revealing and anecdotal, wonderful autobiography. By the way, it was camcorded, so you're stuck with it. And it'll be part of our archives. I don't think we've ever heard a presentation that was really just about spellbinding. And as I looked around the room, everybody was just rapt, looking at you and listening to you. So many, many thanks. We still have a couple minutes to go here. I want to mention that my councilman and president of council, Det Anson, is here, a good friend of the society. Let's give him a little. Tom Scarborough, who's the vice chair of Doylestown Township Board of Supervisors. He seems to show up at most of our events, and he's most welcome. You're all, of course, distinguished guests, and I would love to introduce, well, some of you anyhow. But instead of that, we have some things for you.
Want me to help you?
Sure. First of all, we have a tile that was just done by Katja McGurk. How many of you know Katja? She's really, I think, become Doylestown's premier tile maker.
Beautiful.
And in addition, we have, by the way, this is Michael's book, Instinct. So you all can rush to the book, Doylestown Bookshop and buy a copy. And here is a copy of our book, perhaps you already have one, called Doylestown, which was published in 2000. And see all these people here? My name is here, and people think I'm one of those people. Well, as soon as we arrive, you're most welcome. And I think we have something else here. Well, here is a
Jimmy.
So, many thanks.
Thanks, everybody.